The CEO stared at the conference room table as if it had personally betrayed him. The polished wood reflecting the cold glow of the city skyline beyond the glass walls. And across from him sat the old man everyone called Frank, though his full name was Francis Hawley, a quiet, silver-haired veteran who had worked security for the company for less than a year, arriving early every morning, leaving late every night, never speaking unless spoken to, and never once complaining. Even when younger executives joked about his age or questioned why someone like him was still working at all. And tonight, on Christmas Eve, the CEO had decided to make an example of him. The company was restructuring. Profits were tight, and shareholders wanted blood. Or at least a symbolic sacrifice, and Frank, with his old-fashioned manners and refusal to play corporate politics, seemed like the easiest cut, so the CEO cleared his throat, folded his hands, and announced in a flat, rehearsed tone that Frank's position was being eliminated effective immediately. No severance beyond the minimum, no ceremony, no thank you. Just a printed termination letter slid across the table like a final insult. Frank read it slowly, his weathered hands steady, his expression calm in a way that unsettled the room. And when he finally looked up, he didn't argue or beg. He simply nodded once and said, "Understood, sir. I'll clear out my locker." And that was it. No anger, no bitterness, just quiet acceptance, which made the CEO feel strangely irritated, as if the old man had robbed him of the satisfaction of dominance. As Frank stood and walked out, the CEO felt a flicker of triumph, convinced he had just made a hard but necessary decision, unaware that this single act would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, ownership, and the man he had just dismissed without a second thought. The building was nearly empty, holiday decorations blinking softly in the halls, garlands draped over sleek modern railings, a giant Christmas tree glowing in the lobby. And Frank moved through it all like a ghost, stopping by the security office to turn in his badge, where the young guard on duty looked confused and uncomfortable, wishing him a quiet Merry Christmas that Frank returned with a small smile. What no one in that building knew was that Frank Hawley was not just a retired Navy SEAL who had served decades ago in classified operations that never made the history books, but a man who had learned early that true leverage was never loud, never obvious, and never wasted. And years ago, after leaving active duty, he had quietly built something far more powerful than anyone imagined. The defense contract that kept this very company alive. The one responsible for nearly 60% of its annual revenue. Was not owned by the corporation in the way the CEO believed, but held through a layered network of shell entities and trusts that ultimately traced back to a single private owner. A man who preferred anonymity. A man who understood how fragile arrogance could be. And that man was Frank. He had never needed recognition. Never needed to sit at the head of a table, because real control, he knew, existed far from spotlight and applause. As he packed his few belongings into a small cardboard box, he paused briefly, looking at a framed photo tucked inside his locker. A faded image of younger men in uniform. Faces blurred by time, brothers who never came home. And for a moment, the noise of helicopters and distant gunfire echoed in his memory, reminding him that corporate humiliation was nothing compared to the cost of real failure. He closed the box, taped it shut, and walked out into the cold night, snow beginning to fall lightly, the city buzzing with last-minute shoppers and carols drifting faintly from somewhere down the street. Back upstairs, the CEO poured himself a drink, congratulating himself on decisive leadership, when his phone buzzed with a notification from legal, flagged urgent, and as he opened the email, his confident smile began to fade. The message was short but alarming, referencing a discrepancy in the defense contract renewal, something about a signature authority issue that had surfaced during a routine audit. And before he could fully process it, another call came in. This time from the board's legal counsel, whose voice was unusually tense, asking if the CEO was aware that the company's primary defense contract was not directly owned but licensed, and whether he knew who the licensor actually was. The CEO laughed nervously, dismissing it as a misunderstanding, insisting everything was in order. But the silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably before the lawyer said, "You need to come back to the office immediately. There's something you should see." Minutes later, the CEO was back in the conference room, joined by senior executives who looked pale and confused as documents were projected onto the screen. Layers of corporate structures unraveling one by one until a single name appeared at the center. Francis Hawley, and the room went dead silent. Someone whispered that it had to be a mistake, that the old security guy couldn't possibly be the same person. But the evidence was undeniable: signatures, fingerprints, military clearance records, all aligning perfectly. And the realization hit the CEO like a physical blow, that the man he had just fired on Christmas Eve was not only a veteran but the owner of the contract that justified the CEO's entire position. Panic spread quickly, questions overlapping, voices rising, as they realized the contract included a morality and conduct clause, granting the owner broad discretion to terminate the agreement in cases of bad faith or unethical treatment of key personnel. And suddenly, firing Frank without cause looked less like a cost-saving measure and more like a catastrophic error. The CEO's mind raced, calculating damage control, imagining emergency calls, apologies, even reinstatement offers. But deep down, a cold fear settled in his chest, the kind he hadn't felt since his early career days, when one wrong decision could end everything. Meanwhile, Frank sat alone in his modest apartment, a small Christmas tree in the corner, lights softly glowing. As he placed his box down and removed his coat, moving with deliberate calm. And when his phone rang, he looked at the screen, recognizing the number immediately, letting it ring a few times before answering. His voice steady and polite as always, listening as a frantic executive stumbled through an apology and a request for an urgent meeting. And when Frank finally spoke, he said only, "I'll consider it. Tomorrow. Enjoy your Christmas Eve," before ending the call, leaving the other man staring at his phone in stunned silence, realizing too late that power, once disrespected, does not rush to forgive. Morning arrived quietly, wrapped in a thin layer of snow that softened the city's sharp edges. But inside the corporate headquarters, chaos had already taken root. Executives pacing hallways with phones glued to their ears, assistants whispering urgently, legal teams scrambling to reinterpret clauses they had ignored for years, all while one absence loomed larger than any presence ever had. The absence of Frank Hawley. The CEO sat alone in his office, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night, replaying the moment he slid that termination letter across the table, each second now burning with regret, because every new report confirmed the same brutal truth. The defense contract was not just valuable. It was the backbone of the entire company, the reason investors trusted them, the reason government partners kept calling, the reason the CEO himself had risen so quickly. And all of it rested on a relationship built quietly, respectfully, with a man they had treated like disposable labor. Calls were made, messages sent, offers drafted, including reinstatement with bonuses, public apologies, even ceremonial recognition of Frank's military service. But none received a response, and with every unanswered ring, the balance of power shifted further away from the glass tower and closer to the modest apartment where Frank sat calmly, sipping coffee, watching snow fall outside his window, feeling no urgency at all. He had learned long ago that urgency was a weapon used by the desperate, and he had never survived by being desperate. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an old contact at the Department of Defense, a man who owed Frank his career and possibly his life. warning him that the company was in full panic mode, that the board was considering emergency measures, and asking what Frank intended to do. To which Frank replied simply that he intended to spend Christmas Day in peace, nothing more, nothing less. He turned off the phone and focused on preparing a simple meal, the kind he preferred, methodical and unremarkable. Because control for him was never about excess, it was about choice. Back at headquarters, the board convened an emergency session. Voices overlapping as projections showed worst-case scenarios. Stock prices collapsing, government audits intensifying, contracts frozen, reputations destroyed. And someone finally asked the question no one wanted to voice: whether Frank Holly was the kind of man who would retaliate. The room fell silent as one director, a former intelligence analyst, spoke quietly, saying that SEALs like Frank were trained to assess threats, not emotionally, but strategically. And that humiliation, especially public humiliation, was often interpreted not as an insult but as a data point, a signal of character. And if Frank believed the company's leadership lacked integrity, he would not lash out impulsively. He would simply remove his support and let the structure collapse under its own weight. Christmas Day passed with no word from Frank, no returned calls, no emails, no lawyers appearing at the door, just silence. And that silence became unbearable, each hour stretching longer than the last. Until finally, late that evening, a single email arrived from Frank's private address. Addressed not to the CEO alone, but to the entire board, stating calmly that he would meet them in person the following morning. Not at headquarters, but at a small conference facility near the harbor. And that attendance was mandatory. Relief washed over the executives, but it was the uneasy relief of condemned men granted a final hearing, not a pardon. The next morning, they arrived early, suits pressed, expressions rehearsed, only to find Frank already there, seated at the head of a simple table, dressed not in a security uniform, not in a suit, but in a plain dark coat and sweater, his posture relaxed, his presence commanding without effort. No assistants, no lawyers, no entourage, just Frank, a cup of coffee, and a folder placed neatly in front of him. He stood as they entered, nodded politely, and gestured for them to sit, taking his place only after everyone else had done so. A subtle reminder of courtesy that stung more than any accusation. He began speaking without preamble, his voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of someone who had given orders under fire and expected them to be followed. Explaining that he had never intended to interfere in corporate operations, never sought influence beyond ensuring that the technology developed under his contract was used responsibly and ethically, and that he had taken the security job not for money, but to observe, to understand the culture of the company he supported. Because trust, in his experience, was built by proximity, not reports. He paused then, looking directly at the CEO, and said that what he had observed was a pattern of arrogance, short-term thinking, and disregard for people, and that the decision to fire him on Christmas Eve without cause was not an isolated mistake, but a confirmation of that pattern. The CEO tried to speak, to apologize, to explain the pressures he was under, but Frank raised a hand gently, not angrily, and the room fell silent immediately. Frank said that excuses did not interest him, only outcomes, and then he opened the folder, sliding copies of the contract across the table, pointing out clauses they had ignored, obligations they had neglected, and protections they had taken for granted, making it painfully clear that he held all leverage, and that legally, ethically, and strategically, he was within his rights to terminate the agreement effective immediately. Panic flickered across faces, but Frank continued, saying he did not take pleasure in destruction, that he had seen enough of it in his life, and that what he wanted was accountability, not revenge. He outlined conditions, not demands, conditions under which he would consider continuing the partnership. including leadership changes, transparent governance, and a written commitment to treat employees not as expendable costs, but as assets deserving dignity. Each condition landed like a measured strike, precise and unavoidable. The CEO felt the ground shifting beneath him, realizing that his job, his reputation, and his future were hanging by a thread woven by a man he had underestimated at every level. When Frank finished, he closed the folder and stood, telling them he would give them 48 hours to respond. Not with words, but with actions, and that if those actions were insufficient, he would walk away without hesitation. As he left the room, the executives sat in stunned silence, knowing they had just been judged by someone who did not need their approval, their money, or their power, and that judgment had consequences. Outside, Frank stepped into the cold air, breathing deeply, feeling neither triumph nor anger, only clarity, because for him, this was never about ego. It was about ensuring that the systems he helped build did not become threats themselves. And as he walked along the harbor, watching waves break against steel and stone, he knew that whatever happened next, he had already won something far more valuable than any contract. He had reaffirmed the principle that respect is not optional, and those who forget it eventually pay the price. The 48 hours passed like a slow execution, each minute stretching under the weight of consequences the board could no longer avoid. Because this time there was no PR spin strong enough, no legal maneuver clever enough, and no political connection deep enough to escape the reality Frank Hale had placed in front of them. By the end of the first day, emergency meetings had turned into resignations, and by the morning of the second, the CEO sat alone once more, not in confidence but in defeat, staring at his reflection in the dark glass of his office window, realizing that leadership built on fear and numbers collapsed the moment it encountered principle. The board's decision was unanimous, swift, and brutal. The CEO would step down effective immediately. His contract terminated under a clause he himself had once approved. The same kind of cold efficiency he had used on Frank. And as he signed the final paperwork, a bitter irony settled in. Because now he understood what it meant to be reduced to a line item. A public announcement followed, carefully worded but unmistakable, citing a change in leadership direction and reaffirming commitments to ethical governance. And within hours, the market stabilized, not because investors trusted the company, but because they trusted the unseen hand guiding it back from collapse. That hand remained invisible by choice. Frank received the confirmation quietly, not with satisfaction, but with a calm acceptance that felt final, because outcomes, not apologies, were what mattered to him. The board's written commitments arrived next. Detailed restructuring plans, new oversight committees, revised employee protection policies, and a formal invitation for Frank to assume an advisory role, all of which he reviewed without emotion, assessing not the promises but the architecture behind them. When he finally responded, it was with a brief message confirming continuation of the defense contract under revised conditions and declining any public role, stating simply that influence did not require a title, and that anonymity allowed honesty to survive longer. Life inside the company changed in ways no memo could fully capture. Executives spoke more carefully, managers listened more closely, and decisions once made casually were now weighed with an awareness that unseen consequences existed beyond spreadsheets. Employees noticed it first, the subtle shift in tone, the disappearance of casual cruelty, the return of human language to performance reviews. And though few knew the full story, rumors spread of an old security guard who had walked away and taken power with him, becoming something like a corporate myth, a reminder that respect was not optional. Frank returned to his routines. Quiet mornings, disciplined workouts, long walks near the water, and occasional check-ins with contacts who trusted him not because of his wealth, but because of his consistency. On New Year's morning, he stood on his balcony watching the city wake under pale winter light. thinking not of victory but of responsibility, because ownership, he knew, was not about control, it was about stewardship, about preventing harm by staying present even when recognition was absent. Weeks later, a small envelope arrived at his door, handwritten, from a junior employee he barely remembered, thanking him for showing that dignity mattered, that someone had noticed how people were treated, and that it had changed the way leadership behaved. And Frank folded the note carefully, placing it beside the old photograph of his team, understanding that this, more than any contract, justified his choices. The former CEO watched the company's recovery from a distance, his name fading from relevance, his story retold as a cautionary tale in executive seminars about hubris and blind authority. And though bitterness lingered, it was mixed with a hard-earned clarity that power taken without understanding eventually turns inward and devours its holder. Time moved on, as it always did. Seasons changed, headlines shifted. But the lesson embedded itself quietly into the system, that unseen forces often mattered more than visible titles, and that treating people as disposable always carried hidden costs. One evening months later, Frank was invited to a private military remembrance ceremony, small and unpublicized, where names were read softly and candles were lit for those who never returned. And as he stood among men and women who understood silence better than applause, he felt complete, knowing that the same principles that kept soldiers alive also kept institutions honest. When asked once why he never revealed his role publicly, he answered simply that exposure diluted effectiveness, and that the best safeguards operated quietly, intervening only when lines were crossed. The company continued under new leadership, steadier, humbler, and though profits recovered, something more important stabilized with them, a culture no longer blind to consequence. Frank's life remained modest, intentionally so. His power exercised sparingly, his presence felt only when necessary. Because true authority, he believed, was measured not by how often it was displayed, but by how rarely it needed to be used. On the next Christmas Eve, snow fell again over the city. Lights shimmered in windows, and somewhere in the building that once dismissed him, a quiet acknowledgement was made in policy and practice, that no one would ever again be discarded without thought, because somewhere behind the structure, unseen but unwavering, stood a man who understood.